Over the past several days, an occupied Palestinian territory under Israeli authority has been rocked with violence. But this time, the battle and bloodshed comes not in the war-torn Gaza Strip, once encircled by Israel and now ravaged by the Israel-Hamas war. Instead, the violence takes place in the West Bank, a large stretch of territory between Israel and Jordan, where Israel has maintained an occupation for many decades and where some 500,000 predominantly Jewish religious settlers live in a tenuous balance with roughly 3 million Palestinians. Overnight on Wednesday, August the 28th, Israeli forces streamed into the territory in a major operation split between several West Bank cities. On Thursday the 29th, the operation continued, backed up by helicopters, armored vehicles, and more. Israel's targets are several armed insurgent and terror organizations in the West Bank, all of whom report that they are now fighting back. It is the biggest Israeli military operation in the West Bank in decades, and the territory's first explosion of violence on this scale since the start of the Israel-Hamas war. Now, before we begin, our regular bit of housekeeping. The information provided in this episode is accurate to the best of our ability, with the sourcing available through the evening of Thursday the 29th, West Bank local time. At the time of writing, certain details, like the death toll thus far and whether these operations will continue for subsequent days and nights, are still unknown. But if you'd like to learn more about that information, we suspect it will be available by the time this episode is published. But one thing we do know for certain is that the West Bank raids carried out by the Israel Defense Forces, or IDF, began in the pre-dawn hours of the morning of August the 28th, 2024. At that time, a force of several hundred IDF infantry and other foot soldiers, the precise numbers not yet clear, advanced into several West Bank cities accompanied by air support. The operations covered the cities of Jenin, Tulkarem, Tubas, and Nablus, with a combined population of about 310,000 people, and struck both built-up areas of some of the cities and refugee camps near others. The initial wave of raids saw IDF soldiers, backed up by armored vehicles, close air support, and intelligence collecting and overwatch drones, target suspected or alleged militants in the city, with at least 10 Palestinians believed to have been killed over the course of the day. Drones are known to have launched strikes from the air, including one in the refugee camp of Farah, where at least 4 people were killed. At around the same time, Israeli troops surrounded the main hospital in the city of Jenin, building earthworks barriers with the stated intent of preventing military fighters from retreating there. IDF troops did not enter the hospital. Palestinian sources have claimed that Israeli bulldozers also leveled city infrastructure in both Jenin and Tulkarem. Over the course of the day, an Israeli military spokesperson confirmed that there was a, quote, immediate threat to civilians, but that, quoting here again, the terror threat in this area is not new, it hasn't started yesterday, and it's not going to end tomorrow. Curfews were announced in parts of the West Bank by that evening. The retaliation by local militant terror groups was violent in kind. Within hours, 3 such groups announced that their fighters were detonating bombs against Israeli military vehicles in several locations. Those groups included Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, both of which maintain an armed presence in the West Bank that's separate from their forces fighting in Gaza, as well as Fatah, the group that controls the Palestinian Authority and thus exercises limited civil control over the West Bank. At the time of writing, no fatalities have been reported on the Israeli side of the raids, and it's unclear just how effective these bomb attacks were or were not. But with militants acting in and around cities like Jenin that have been militant hubs for many years, there is likely a good deal of ordnance as well as fighters who may have waited out the early days of the incursion to see whether the situation would return to an equilibrium. Early on Thursday the 29th, the IDF raids continued, with the most notable of the raids coming in the city of Tulkarem. There, 5 militants, swearing allegiance to the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, were cornered after hiding in a mosque and killed in a shootout with the IDF. Among the fighters killed was Mohammed Jaber, known best by his alias Abu Shuja, who had gained fame in the West Bank earlier this year after showing up alive to funerals of other militants who had been killed in an operation where he too had been reported dead. Abu Shuja was, according to the IDF, responsible for the killing of at least 1 Israeli and carrying out many attacks, and he had allegedly been planning to commit more. Those 5 militants were the only ones reported killed on the 29th, in a day that saw fewer raids but a sustained Israeli presence. That presence included the maintenance of the IDF's blockade around Jenin's central hospital as Israeli troops set up checkpoints for ambulances coming in, along with internet and cellular services being shut down and some areas not having water or sewage services. With 16 people reported dead by the end of the day on Thursday, this is now Israel's single deadliest operation in the West Bank since before October the 7th, 2023. Objectives and context. Now, when it comes to the reasons why these West Bank raids have taken place, the obvious place to start is Israel. After all, it is the Israeli government and the IDF that have chosen to launch these operations at all. According to Israel, the intent is to conduct counterterrorism operations in what the IDF states will be a multi-step process. Per Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz posting online in the early hours of the incursion, the IDF is working to dismantle a terror threat in the West Bank in the same way it's been dismantling terror threats in Gaza. Katz also stated that temporary evacuation of Palestinian residents is apparently on the table. Shortly after Katz's statement, IDF spokesperson and Lieutenant Colonel Nadav Shoshani indicated that there is not a soon-to-be-instituted plan for evacuations, but that local residents can leave if they like. Early on, international news outlets indicated that the operation was likely tied to a prior airstrike on Monday the 26th in the West Bank, where 5 people, described by the IDF as terrorists, were killed in an area called Nur Shams. As operations continued, Israel clarified the terror threat it claimed to be observing in the West Bank. Foreign Minister Katz offered the quote, "Iran is working to establish an eastern terrorist front against Israel in the West Bank, according to the Gaza and Lebanese model," with those models Katz referenced being the Hamas and Hezbollah organizations. IDF sources have claimed for several months that Iran is working through smuggling routes across the Middle East to flood the West Bank with as many weapons as possible and create a potential new front in Israel's war against its Palestinian population. Over the last year, roughly 150 attacks have been launched against Israelis from the northern West Bank, according to IDF figures. Per the aforementioned IDF spokesman Nadav Shoshani, current operations are targeting, quote, "a mixture of terror groups and terror cells," and IDF statements have indicated that in addition to the, quote, "armed terrorists that its forces have killed, other wanted suspects have been taken into custody as weapons and military supplies have been seized. IDF troops have been able to dig up and dismantle improvised explosive devices, including dangerous roadside bombs. Palestinians in the West Bank, however, have offered a competing explanation on why Israel has chosen to launch such an incursion. The real objective, many people there suspect, and the Hamas organization claims, is for Israel to broaden its control over the West Bank and advance its occupation. Those suspicions are helped along by a situation widely regarded as discriminatory law enforcement in Palestine, where Palestinians who attack Israelis in the West Bank are swiftly and sometimes fatally punished, but Jewish settlers who carry out attacks against Palestinians, often with just as lethal consequences, go without any serious rebuke. Settler attacks are not an isolated phenomenon either. The UN's Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs has counted nearly 1,300 attacks since October the 7th of last year. Per the AFP, a total of over 650 Palestinians, including many militants, have been killed in the West Bank in that same timeframe by a combination of IDF soldiers and settlers. Of course, we do want to be clear that according to both the IDF and the West Bank's major militant organizations, the current fighting is largely or fully between Israeli soldiers and Palestinian fighters. But it is just as important to understand the public perception of the incident as it is to understand the reality, because both, not just one or the other, will guide future action on both sides. And now, it's here that we start getting into the broader context of this raid. So, for the sake of telling the story properly, we'll at least delve into the basics. We would need a far longer episode to explain the full history of the territory known as the West Bank, and we can certainly explore an episode of that kind. If you're interested, just let us know in the comments. But rather than provide that exhaustive history here, we'll focus on the critical context that should help make sense of those most recent IDF operations. Living under Israeli occupation since the late 1960s, Palestinians in the West Bank have long held a bitter animosity toward Israel. Their more militarily powerful neighbor has asserted a status quo where Palestinians have no right to vote, little means to advocate for themselves, and have to abide by what's largely seen as a puppet government backed by the Israeli leadership. The construction and expansion of Jewish settlements in the West Bank has been a major point of conflict and has been condemned by much of the world for decades. As a result, a deep cultural ethos of resistance to Israel has been a major part of life in the West Bank for a very long time, and the population there lost faith long ago in peace processes that are now remembered as a charade by Israel. Armed resistance is now a mainstay of the West Bank, generally framed as freedom fighting by its supporters and as terrorism by its opponents, and major explosions of violence have left deep marks on the people there, regardless of what side of the conflict they're on. The city of Jenin, in particular, holds major symbolic value to both sides. For Israelis, it's remembered as the point of origin of dozens of suicide bombers who attacked Israel during the Second Intifada, a long stretch of violent revolt against Israel's occupation in the early 2000s. For Palestinians, it's both a long-respected center of resistance and popular discontent and the site of a 2002 battle where dozens of Palestinians, about half believed to be civilians, and about 24 Israeli soldiers were killed. Since the start of the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza, the West Bank has largely become an afterthought for global governments and press. But even before the start of this operation, the West Bank hasn't been quite a part of Israel by any means. Although no single violent incident has risen to the scale and scope of this current Israeli occupation since the start of the war in Gaza, the West Bank has nonetheless been a violent and difficult place. On one side, Israeli and other Jewish settlers living in the West Bank have attacked and repressed local Palestinians with impunity, organizing into militias that are empowered by and often reinforced by local IDF forces, and that have committed numerous and sometimes fatal attacks against Palestinians. On the other, dozens of shooting attacks against Israelis have been traced back to the West Bank over the last year, and just a couple of weeks ago, an attempted suicide bombing was botched by pure chance when an aspiring bomber from the West Bank had his backpack bomb detonate just moments before he may have breached a synagogue during evening prayers. In October and December of last year, and in January and April of 2024, prior raids by the IDF have killed several dozen people, including at least 8 children. In this part of its territory, Israel has long employed a strategy referred to as cutting the grass, engaging in frequent and sporadic operations to destroy and root out active militant threats without committing to a long-term engagement of troops. As one former IDF intelligence officer, Michael Milstein, put to the Associated Press, quoting here, "You see something growing, you need to cut it. But it means that in 2 months, you will be there again. By all indicators, that's still the approach." But to borrow the IDF's own parlance for a moment, the size and scale of this current advance into the West Bank indicates that the grass, so to speak, had gotten a bit too long. By Israel's own statements on the purported flood of weapons into the West Bank and the rising terrorist threat that it's responding to, the situation in the West Bank isn't sustainable forever. There are plenty of proponents of mowing the grass in Israel, just as there are many people who say it doesn't work and has never worked. But as an antidote to the rise in anger and violent intent that Israel is calling out in the West Bank, mowing the grass does not appear to be sufficient. Hamas, Fatah, and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad indicated during this most recent operation that they weren't avoiding a fight, they were spoiling for one. And if that's where their sentiments are at this stage of the current conflict, then we may not be able to refer to low-grade hostilities in the West Bank for much longer.